Behind the white columns of Callaway Plantation, the world looked exactly as it was meant to look: ordered, prosperous, untouchable. The year was 1847, Sunflower County, Mississippi, deep in the heart of the Delta, where the land was so flat you could watch a storm come from 50 miles away and still have nowhere to run, where the summer heat pressed down on everything like a hand that never lifted, where the air smelled of red clay, river water, and something else that no one named out loud, but everyone recognized. Hello, welcome to the Memoirs of Shackles channel. Here you will find dramatic and revealing stories, inspired by the era of slavery, that will leave you emotional. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these stories. Oh, and take advantage of the opportunity to download a free ebook with an unpublished story. The link is in the pinned comment. Enjoy. Cotton had made men like Harlan Callaway into kings. Not the kind of kings history reads about in school books. The quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind whose power lived not in crowns, but in deeds, ledgers, and silence. The kind of men who built their kingdoms one season at a time and called it civilization. Harlan had inherited the plantation from his father in 1839 when he was just 26 years old. His father, Edmund Callaway, had carved the property out of Delta wilderness in the 1810s, when Mississippi had only just become a state and the land was still being taken from the Choctaw and Chickasaw, nations at the point of federal policy and local violence. Edmund had arrived with $30, a land grant, and an appetite that the soil of the Delta was uniquely positioned to feed. By 1847, Callaway Plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of some of the richest soil in the known world. The Mississippi Delta black earth, dark, dense, almost purple in the early morning light, had been deposited over thousands of years by the flooding of the Great River. Farmers from the Carolinas and Virginia, who came west in the 1820s and 1830s, called it the Promised Land. The earth was so fertile, it almost seemed to push crops upward by its own will. Cotton had become the engine of the entire American economy by the middle of the 19th century. It accounted for more than half of all United States exports. The textile mills of New England and England depended on it. The banks of New York financed it. The ships of Liverpool carried it across the Atlantic. And the labor that made all of it possible was extracted, without payment and without mercy, from the bodies of enslaved human beings. At the peak of the cotton economy, a single bale sold for anywhere between $40 and $50 in the markets of Natchez and Memphis. Callaway was moving over 400 bales a season. The numbers made his neighbors lower their eyes with envy and raise their glasses in false admiration. Natchez, 200 miles to the south along the river, was the commercial heart of Mississippi cotton culture. It was where factors handled the sale of bales, where planters negotiated credit, where the wealth of the Delta was converted into the carriages and silver and imported furniture that filled the parlors of the big houses. Natchez under the hill, the trading district at the river's edge, was one of the busiest slave markets in the entire South. Men arrived in chains from Virginia and the Carolinas, states whose soil was exhausted, and were sold into the expanding cotton frontier of Mississippi and Louisiana like tools for a machine that was never satisfied. To run that kind of operation required something no man of his era wanted to say plainly. It required people. Callaway held 112 enslaved men, women, and children on his property. 64 worked the fields from first light to last, moving through the rows in a rhythm enforced not by choice, but by the constant presence of the overseer and the knowledge of what happened to those who slowed. The rest maintained the grounds, the stables, the kitchen, and the house itself, a two-story Greek revival structure with tall white columns and wide verandas that caught the evening breeze off the Sunflower River. The cotton gin, installed in 1841, could process 50 bales a day during harvest season. The blacksmith shop kept the tools in order. The smokehouse preserved the meat that fed the White family through winter. Every corner of the plantation was a system within a system, and every system depended on labor that cost Harlan Callaway nothing but the original purchase price and the ongoing cost of bare subsistence. Inside the big house lived Harlan, his wife Catherine, and their 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. And inside that house, something was already beginning to crack. Catherine Calloway was not the woman Harlan had married in the polished parlors of Natchez society 9 years earlier. That woman had been composed, decorative, careful, raised in a family that had prospered from the same system, and never once asked whether the prosperity was built on something they could not hold. She had arrived at Calloway Plantation as a bride of 19 with a trousseau of fine linen and a complete set of unspoken agreements about what she would and would not allow herself to see. 9 years had worn those agreements thin. It had started with small things. A bruise she was not supposed to notice on the arm of a woman named Delilah, who brought the morning coffee every day without a word and without eye contact, moving through the bedroom with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being noticed was rarely to her advantage. A sound she heard one night from across the yard, a sound that stopped as suddenly as it started, and the way she had pressed a pillow to her ears and stared at the ceiling until her heart slowed. A child she saw in the yard one afternoon, whose face stopped her breath for a moment before she looked away and kept walking. A child whose features arranged themselves in a configuration she recognized. A child about whom nothing would ever be said. And a name she overheard spoken in the fields, Solomon. And the way every other voice went immediately quiet when the overseer walked past. Solomon had arrived at Calloway Plantation 3 years earlier, purchased at a trading house in Natchez for $620. He was recorded in Harlan Calloway's ledger with the flat economy of the era. Male, approximately 22 years of age, strong constitution, no distinguishing marks. Origin listed as Virginia, prior owner unknown. What the ledger did not record was the quality of his mind. Solomon could read, not just a little, not the halting, partial literacy of someone who had learned a few letters by accident. He could read the way educated men read, fluently, quickly, hungrily, with the kind of comprehension that comes from having used reading as a private form of survival for years. No one knew how he had learned, he never said. He understood, with perfect clarity, that the answer to that question would only create problems for whoever had taught him. But the overseer had caught him once with a torn page from a newspaper pressed flat under his knee while he worked the gin, his eyes moving across the lines in the brief seconds between tasks. The page contained a report from a congressional debate about the expansion of slavery into new territories. Solomon had read it 3 times before the overseer looked up. The overseer reported it to Harlan. Harlan said nothing, noted it, filed it somewhere behind his eyes. That was how Harlan Calloway operated. He collected information the way other men collected debts, patiently, without displaying the collection, with interest that compounded invisibly until the moment he chose to spend it. Solomon was moved from the fields to the house, not as a reward, as a closer watch. He was assigned to the library, dusting, organizing, maintaining the books and papers that Harlan Calloway rarely read himself. Harlan was not a reading man. The library had been assembled by his father, who believed that a certain number of leather-bound volumes conveyed a certain kind of respectability, and Harlan had added to it occasionally when he wanted to project the same message. But the books themselves held little interest for him. For Solomon, assignment to the library was something that cannot be described in the language of that era's ledgers. It was, on the surface, a position of some privilege, out of the sun, out of the fields, closer to the house, sleeping in a room off the kitchen rather than in the quarters. In reality, it was a trap with a longer leash. Harlan wanted to see what Solomon would do with access to that room, wanted to watch, wanted to know the full shape of what he was dealing with. But Solomon understood traps. He had been living inside one his entire life. He knew the difference between a privilege and a test, and he knew that the correct response to a test was to pass it in the way that caused the least amount of attention, while quietly continuing to do what you are going to do anyway. He dusted the books. He organized them with meticulous care. He returned them to exactly the right positions. And in the moments between tasks, in the silences when no one was present, he read. He read history. He read geography. He read law, or what passed for it in the volumes available to him, though the law of that era offered him nothing but the formal language of his own negation. He read accounts of the Northwest Territory, of the free states above the Ohio River, of the cities in the North where men who looked like him moved through streets without chains. He read maps with the focused attention of someone memorizing a route. Catherine began to notice him the way one notices a fire in a fireplace, not because you choose to look, but because light draws the eye, regardless of your intentions. Solomon moved through the library with a precision that had nothing to do with cleaning. He knew where every volume was shelved. He returned them to exactly the right position. Sometimes, when she passed the open door in the early afternoon, she saw his lips moving faintly, barely perceptibly, over words that existed somewhere between silence and sound. She said nothing. He said nothing. But something had been acknowledged between them. Something without words, which in that house was the only safe language available. The weeks passed. The cotton grew toward harvest. A delta heat settled over everything like a second sky that sat lower than the real one and pressed everything flat beneath it. Catherine started finding reasons to pass by the library and reasons to enter it. She told herself she was looking for a particular volume of correspondence, then for a map, then for a book she thought she remembered from years ago. She stopped telling herself anything at all after a while. The reasons had always been a formality she was conducting for her own benefit, and she had stopped finding them convincing. Their conversations began in the careful, restricted language of two people who understand with perfect precision how much is at stake in every syllable. Weather, the condition of the garden after the last rain, whether the roof over the east wing was holding against the summer storms that rolled in off the river every few weeks. Safe words, neutral words, words that held no weight on their surface, an enormous weight underneath. Solomon was not unaware of the danger. He understood it with a clarity that Catherine, despite her growing and genuine awareness, could not fully reach from where she stood. For her, the consequences of any exposure would be social ruin, the destruction of her marriage, the loss of her children, the end of the life she had built inside the only world she had been taught to inhabit. These were real. These were serious. She did not minimize them. But for Solomon, the consequences of a misstep had no polite name in the social vocabulary of Sunflower County, Mississippi. In 1847, he had watched it happen to others. He had seen men flogged in the yard for offenses that the overseer recorded as insubordination, and that had been nothing more than the failure to move fast enough on a hot afternoon. He had seen a man sold away from his wife and children in November because Harlan Calloway needed to settle a debt before the end of the year, and the man had been loaded onto a wagon and taken south toward Natchez, while his family stood in the yard and the world simply continued around them, indifferent and unchanged. Solomon knew what the system was. He had no illusions about it. He had learned very young that illusions were a luxury that cost more than they were worth. And yet, there are moments in a person's life when the weight of everything they have never been permitted to be becomes heavier than the fear of what will happen if they reach for it. When the calculation shifts, not because the danger disappears, but because the cost of remaining still finally exceeds the cost of moving. For Solomon, that moment arrived on a Tuesday evening in September, when the first hint of cooler air had begun to come in off the river after sunset, and the cotton in the fields stood at its fullest, white and heavy, and nearly ready for harvest. The plantation was at its most tense and electric. Every able hand was being positioned for the weeks of brutal work ahead. The overseer was moving through the quarters in the evenings with new instructions and new expectations. Harlan had ridden out to supervise the first wagons being loaded for the gin. The house was quieter than usual. Catherine was in the library. Solomon entered with a cloth and a bucket, as he did every evening, moving with the practiced normalcy of a man who has made an art of appearing unremarkable. She was holding a letter. Her hands were not quite steady. He did not ask what was in it, but he did not leave the room either, which was itself a kind of answer to a question that neither of them had spoken aloud. She looked up. The letter was from her sister in Natchez, written in the tight, controlled hand of a woman who had learned to deliver difficult information inside the grammar of social correspondence. 18 lines of careful pleasantries wrapped around a single fact that Catherine's sister felt obliged to report because silence, in this case, seemed the worse option. Harlan had purchased a young woman at auction in Jackson 2 months prior. She had been installed in one of the quarters near the Southfield. The sister had heard it from the wife of a factor who had been present at the sale. This was not uncommon in the world Catherine inhabited. It was, in fact, a silence so common and so complete that it had its own grammar, its own set of unspoken protocols about wives saw and did not see, what they said and did not say, what they were permitted to feel, and what they were required to perform instead. The wives of planters throughout the Delta understood this grammar fluently. They had been raised inside it. Some of them enforced it on each other with a social precision that was its own form of violence. But something in Catherine had stopped obeying that grammar. She set the letter down on the desk. Solomon looked at it. He had already read it. He had seen it on the desk when he entered the room, and he had read it in the seconds before she looked up, the way he read everything that was left within his sight. He did not tell her this. He said, in a voice low enough that it existed only in that room, "Some things can't be kept in order, no matter how much a man wants to believe they can." It was the most dangerous sentence ever spoken inside that house, not because of what it implied about Harlan Calloway, but because of what it opened in the space between the two people standing on opposite sides of a desk in a library in Sunflower County, Mississippi. In a year when the law, the church, the economy, and the entire social structure of their world said that such a space was not permitted to exist. The weeks that followed were the kind that do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening. They accumulate in silence, one small thing after another, each one defensible on its own terms, and collectively something else entirely. A book left open to a specific page, a passage about the geography of Illinois, about the city of Chicago, about the lake that sat at the top of the country like a second ocean. A hand that remained near another hand, a half-second longer than the task at hand required, then withdrew without acknowledgement. A question asked in a low voice about freedom looked like in places where it was permitted to have a face and a name and a life that no one could purchase. Solomon answered those questions carefully, truthfully, without the protective softening that would have made the answers easier to hear, but less useful. He had a plan. He had been building it for 2 years, assembling it the way a man builds something that must remain invisible until it is complete, piece by piece, in whatever moments he could find, hiding each piece so carefully that no single person ever held enough of it to understand the whole. He knew the roads that ran north through the Delta toward Memphis. He knew the patrol schedules, not from any single source, but from the slow accumulation of observation across dozens of nights, noting the timing of hoofbeats, the direction of lantern light, the patterns that men fall into when they believe they are being observed by no one of consequence. He knew which rivers could be forded in which seasons, and which ones would be suicide to attempt after the spring rains. He knew that the Sunflower River ran low in September, low enough to cross at the bend 2 miles north of the plantation without being pulled under. He knew that the Underground Railroad was not a railroad and not underground, but that it was real and that it moved through Mississippi with more frequency and sophistication than they, newspapers, or the politicians wished to acknowledge. He knew the name of a man in a town north of Greenville who asked no questions and expected nothing in return, and had helped 6 people disappear in the past. 3 years without a single one being recaptured. He had never intended to include anyone else in the plan. But Catherine had, by the time September arrived, become something he had not anticipated, not an obstacle, not exactly a complication, something harder to name. A person who had looked directly at what was in front of her and had not looked away, which in that world was rarer than it should have been, and more consequential than either of them could fully calculate. He told her he was leaving. Not when, not the route. Enough so that she knew, and enough so that she would not wake one morning and believe something had happened to him. She did not ask to go with him. She understood the geography of her own situation with the same clarity she was bringing to everything else. Her children were in that house. Her children were 7 and 5 years old, and she was not leaving them. She said only, "Be careful," which was an absurd thing to say, and she knew it. And she said it anyway, because there was nothing else available in the language she had been given. Harlan Calloway noticed nothing for 6 weeks. Then he noticed everything at once. It was a Sunday. Church services in Indianola, a county seat 14 miles east, along the road that followed the curve of the Sunflower. After the service, in the slow dispersal of the congregation into the September afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Eliza Pruitt, wife of a neighboring planter, a woman whose social function consisted largely of monitoring and transmitting information, leaned toward Catherine and said something in a voice so low it barely disturbed the air between them. What she said, Catherine would never repeat to anyone, but her expression shifted for a fraction of a second, a small involuntary movement, a flicker, like the flame of a candle when a door opens somewhere in another part of the house. Harlan saw it from 8 feet away. He said nothing on the ride home. The children sat between them in the carriage, talking about something they had seen near the church, and Harlan answered them in the appropriate intervals, while watching the road and thinking with the cold, methodical patience that was his most genuinely dangerous quality. He said nothing at dinner. He was pleasant. He asked about the children's lessons. He complimented the food. He went to the library after the household was quiet. The room looked exactly as it always did. Books in their positions, desk clear, the lamp trimmed and burning at the correct level. Everything in its proper place, which was itself a kind of language spoken by a man who had learned to communicate through surfaces. Harlan was not a reading man, but he was a thorough one. He moved through the room with the systematic attention of someone who is not looking for anything specific because he has already decided he will find something. Behind the third shelf, in the gap between the shelf and the wall, a board that had always seemed flush with the floor sat at an angle that was almost imperceptible. Almost. He worked it free with the patience of a man who has no particular urgency because he already knows how this ends. Underneath, it was a folded piece of paper. The paper was covered on both sides with handwriting. Small, careful, deliberate. That was not his, and not Catherine's. Roads marked with distances. River crossings marked with seasonal notes. Names written in careful letters. Names of towns. Names of people. A route that began in Sunflower County and ended somewhere north of Memphis in a state where the laws said different things than the laws of Mississippi. Harlan stood in the library for a long time. He was a man who had always understood that the proper response to information was patience, to hold it until you knew exactly how to spend it, to resist the impulse toward immediate action, which was the impulse of smaller men. He folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He went to bed. He did not speak to Catherine that night. In the hours before dawn, when the moon was dark and the air off the river moved through the delta with the first real coolness of the season, Solomon was already gone. He had moved in the night he had chosen across 2 years of careful observation, a night when the moon offered no light, when the patrol rotation was at its thinnest point in the monthly cycle, when the fields were quiet with the particular silence that falls over a place when the people who work it are exhausted down to the bone. He had crossed the Sunflower River at the bend 2 miles north, where the water ran shallow and cold over flat stones in September. He had moved north along the tree line, keeping off the road, navigating by the stars with the same precision he brought to everything else. And by the time the first gray light appeared over the flat eastern horizon of the delta, he was far enough from Calloway Plantation that the white columns of the big house were no longer visible. Even if anyone had been looking from the right direction, Catherine had known he was leaving. She had not told her husband. She had not gone with him. She had stood at the window of her bedroom in the hours before dawn, in the particular darkness of a delta night, when the sky and the land lose their separation and the whole world seems to exist in a single undifferentiated black. And she had watched the shapes of things she could not quite see. And she had understood something that had no clean name in the vocabulary available to her. That some doors, once you know they exist, cannot be forgotten, even if you cannot walk through them yourself. even if the life on your side of the door holds you there with the weight of children. Inhabit in a world that has never offered you a different set of choices. Harlan Calloway posted notices within 48 hours. The standard language. $50 reward for the return of an enslaved man named Solomon, approximately 25 years of age, 5 feet 11 inches. Last seen at Calloway Plantation in Sunflower County. The notices went to Natchez and Memphis, to the newspapers, to the county sheriffs, to the network of slave catchers who worked the Delta roads with dogs and the efficient dispatching of men doing a job. He gave a physical description that was accurate in every detail. He made no mention of the library, no mention of the map, no mention of the folded letter from Natchez, or what he had found under the floorboard. He was a man who understood what to leave out, who understood that some information shared created more problems than it resolved, who understood that the story he told about what had happened in his house was as important as what had actually happened there. He also never asked Catherine directly what she knew. She was never certain whether this was because he already knew the answer or because he had decided, with his characteristic cold calculation, that the asking would cost him more than the not asking. They lived in the same house for 11 more years. They attended the same church. They hosted the same dinners. They raised the same children. The form of the marriage continued with the precision of a mechanism that has been built to run without requiring anyone to believe in it. Whether Solomon made it north, the records do not say. The ledger at Calloway Plantation recorded him in the column marked absconded, September 1847, with a notation of value lost that converted a human life into an accounting entry and filed it among the other losses of that season. A mule that died of colic, a section of fence taken out by a flood, a bale lost in transit to Natchez. The cotton harvest of 1847 was one of the best in the history of Calloway Plantation. 431 bales, sold at $43 each in the Natchez market. The numbers went into the ledger in Harlan Calloway's careful hand. Column after column, everything accounted for, everything in its proper place, except the things that were not. Catherine lived in that house until 1858, when Harlan died of a fever contracted during a business trip to New Orleans, and the plantation passed to their son, who was 16 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's silences. She never spoke of Solomon to anyone. She never spoke of what she had known and when she had known it, or what she had chosen to do and what she had chosen not to do, or what the difference had cost her in the long, dark currency of a life lived inside a world whose rules she had finally, too late and too quietly, stopped believing in. But some silences are not empty. Some silences are the loudest thing in the room. And in the great houses of the Mississippi Delta, where the cotton grew white and heavy every season, and the Sunflower River moved south without asking anyone's permission, and the black earth produced its abundance without any acknowledgement of what it had cost. There were more silences of that kind than history ever learned to count. Most of them were never recorded. Most of them were never meant to be. But they happened, and they changed everything. And they left no mark that the ledgers of the time were designed to hold.
Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, a little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen.
I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. If I never met you, maybe I would know just how to heal, but now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true.